This is Think Inclusive. I'm Tim Villegas. How do educators in schools work towards building more inclusive environments for all learners? Sam Drazin from Changing Perspectives stops by to discuss after these messages. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Think Inclusive, where each week we bring you conversations about inclusive education and what inclusion looks like in the real world. This week, our guest is Sam Drazin, a nationally recognized educator and changemaker, founder and executive director, who applies his personal and professional background to lead Changing Perspectives. Their mission is to strengthen school communities through social emotional learning, disability awareness, empathy development, and inclusion. Sam was born with Treacher-Collins syndrome, a rare congenital disorder resulting in both facial anomaly and hearing loss. His experiences, both as a student with a disability and as a teacher working in an inclusive classroom, helped him recognize the importance of supporting students in developing the essential life and relationship skills that underpin equity, inclusion, and social change. The students and educators they work with around the nation are a constant inspiration for Sam. In this episode, Sam Drazin discusses the importance of inclusion in schools, emphasizing the need for a growth mindset and incremental changes. His organization, Changing Perspectives, works with schools to create authentically inclusive learning experiences. The impact of their work is evident in partner schools, where specific goals like social inclusion on the playground have tangible results. Sam encourages educators to make small, manageable changes to enhance inclusivity, aiming for a 10% improvement in their practices regularly. Sam was such a good sport for our interview. I was having a very, very bad podcast technology day, and nothing was working as it was supposed to. So thank you, Sam, for being such a fabulous guest. Before we get into my conversation with Sam, I want to tell you about our sponsor for this week and the entire month of June, the Described and Captioned Media Program. DCMP is the nation's leading source of accessible educational videos. Membership is free for families and school personnel with at least one early learner through grade 12 student with a disability, and it includes free access to thousands of videos and educational television series with captions, audio description, and American Sign Language. DCMP also provides guidelines for captioning and describing educational media, as well as professional development and e-learning resources. DCMP is fully funded by the U.S. Department of Education. And did I mention its services are free? Check them out at dcmp.org. And now my conversation with Sam Drazin. Oh, and for free time this week, a look back at some of my favorite episodes of this season. Sam, let's talk about inclusion. Why is inclusion important to you?
Well, Tim, you really like to start with the big questions. I think about both my experience as a classroom teacher as well as my experience as a student in the K-12 system. And reflecting on those experiences really led me to thinking about inclusion in a different way. I think inclusion is important because inclusion is our world, right? It's interesting in our schools, we segregate based on ability and or disability. But in the world, we don't necessarily segregate based on ability and or disability. I think it's really important that our schools are essentially a microcosm for the real world to help our students learn about themselves, learn about others, be mindful of how other people experience the world, being mindful of how other people communicate and collaborate in order to really prepare students today to be the change makers for a more inclusive tomorrow.
I love that example, Sam, about our world is automatically, I mean, everyone is in it. And so we really do have to live with each other. And you would think that one of the best places to learn that would be schools, especially because typically you go to school because it's in your neighborhood. I know that there's different ways of going to school. You know, some go to charter schools, some go to private schools, but it's when we're talking about public schools in the public space and sector, your neighborhood schools, you go to schools with your neighbors. And so it's the same sort of thing. You go to stores, you go to the park, and it's just not feasible for everyone to have their own separate store or space. And life would be much less interesting if we couldn't all be together.
And I think what's interesting is, why do we segregate students for the first 18 years of their lives, right? Most kids are in school for, from the age of, 3 or 4 up until almost 18. So it's actually a disservice to not provide an inclusive experience, because why would we want to wait till a person is 18 to then put them in a situation where they are around folks who are different from them in any way, whether that's a physical difference, communication difference, a language difference, an ethnic difference. And I come to this work through students with through the lens of students with disabilities, but I really see inclusion as, it's a tier 1 intervention. It is to support all students, regardless of how they might be classified or diagnosed.
Right. Right. And great point about why do we do that for, our youngest learners all the way till, 18. Um, you work with a lot of educators, and I know a lot of educators listen. And for the most part, what I know about educators, being a former public school teacher, nobody gets into this job wanting to segregate kids. Like, you, you become a teacher because maybe you were inspired by a teacher when you were going to school, or maybe you have a teacher in your family, or maybe you just have this desire to help people. Nobody goes in with this preconceived notion of that everyone needs to be separate, but that's the reality for so many educators. And I just wonder, like, how do we as educators push back against a system that is by design meant to separate people, especially when we're talking about general and special education?
That's what I do every day. And I have greater success in some schools and some districts than others. I think, what you said is really true. Our public school system in this country is unintentionally ableistic. You think about the history of the public school system, right? It was designed to push workers through during like the Industrial Revolution. So it was built to assimilate. It was, how do we push students through so we spit out as many like-minded workers as possible? And so if you are not able to keep up, or you don't move in the same way, or you don't think in the same way, or you don't act in the same way as the majority, we're going to push you off to the side because you're kind of holding back this progress. So the question of how do we move forward with it really, I think, comes down to two things. One, it's an acknowledgement of how ableistic our system actually is. And two, it's about changing mindsets. Saying that our system is designed to separate students is not something that I think a lot of superintendents or directors of special education or principals even want to say, right? Because if we admit the faults in our system, we are kind of declaring that we're going to do something to change it. And it's really hard to make those changes. So I think the first thing is, how do we cultivate spaces and places and give, especially leaders, permission to list all of the faults of our system, that are putting up constant barriers for creating more authentically inclusive learning environments, right? Like we have to start there. We have to say it. We have to name it in a way that is not judgmental, in a way that doesn't elicit any sense of embarrassment, right? Like we need to name it. We need to name what's going on in our system. After that, the next step is changing mindsets because you can give teachers all the tools they want, right? Give us tools for our toolbox, give us strategies. You can put as many paraeducators in a classroom to support teachers. You can give them as much professional development as you want or can. But if we don't change our mindsets, we're not going to utilize those supports, whether it be training or additional paraeducators, et cetera, to really move the system forward. And so what do I mean by mindset? One of the questions that I always ask when I go into a school to consult, the first question I always ask to school leaders is what percentage of your teaching staff view all students as their students? And you would be surprised, Tim, how low that number is in a lot of schools. 10%, 15%, 20%, right? Like that's a huge clue into the lack of inclusive mindset within an individual building. So we really need to spend time. We need to be less reactive. We need to spend a little more time building and providing opportunities to cultivate inclusive mindsets before we jump in with the reactive responses of, oh, we'll give you this training, or, we'll throw another paraeducator in your classroom. So naming it, focusing on building inclusive mindsets.
Well, if for those of you watching on video, you have a background that says changing perspectives, which is your organization. Tell us what is changing perspectives, and I don't know, do you have an origin story that you can share?
Yeah. So what are we? We are a nonprofit organization. We work with schools at a national, and we're even starting to tap into the international market now. So I guess I can actually say we are an international nonprofit organization, and we partner and collaborate with schools and districts to work alongside them in creating more authentically inclusive learning experiences for students. We do our work in a variety of ways through supporting schools through professional development trainings, family engagement workshops, ongoing consultation. We also have curriculum resources. And so we really pride ourselves with being a direct service organization. We are boots on the ground every day, going in and out of schools in person or in and out of schools virtually, and helping schools think about where are you in your inclusion journey? Where are you looking to go? And how can we help you get there?
Awesome. And where did it come from? Was it something that you started on your own and then brought people with you, or like what's that like?
Yeah, so I had this aha moment when I was a third grade teacher, working in a general education classroom environment, and quickly realized that the expectation on me as a gen ed teacher was to create an inclusive learning community for my students. But yet I was given zero support or training on how to do it. And I remember one day just teaching and looking around my classroom and noticing the various differences. Some were visible differences in my students, some were invisible differences in my students, and thinking to myself, am I really creating opportunities for all students to feel a sense of belonging? Am I really creating an academic experience where all students have the ability to access content, participate in the learning experience, and demonstrate their knowledge that works for them? Am I creating a classroom environment where all students are physically included? And I kind of, again, had to ask myself those hard questions. And honestly, Tim, the answer was no to a lot of the questions. No, I'm not. And I started like searching, like, well, how do I get support? How do I figure out how to do this? And realized there wasn't much out there. So Changing Perspectives actually started as an organization, and we only did one thing back in the day. We worked with schools and we helped them put on what we call the Disability Awareness Day, right? So you probably remember this when you were in school. There was probably like one day at one point during your K-12 career where, they brought in wheelchairs and you got to ride around in them, or, you were blindfolded and you had to make your way through an obstacle course. So that's how it started. So the first few years of Changing Perspectives, we were just working with schools and helping them put on these one-day disability awareness events. And after a few years, I started to come to the realization of, well, this is great, but, right, how is this really changing systems? How is this building capacity to do this work on an ongoing basis? And then from there, kind of continue to build out our a la carte menu, as I like to say, of the ways in which we support schools. And success brings success, and traction creates more traction. We started this organization about 8 years ago. In our first year, we had 12 partner schools in just about 3 states. The school year that we're wrapping up now, we're ending with about 365 partner schools in over 30 states, reaching about 175,000 students, which is just really exciting.
Wow, that's fantastic. Really amazing. Do you have any stories on top of your mind about the impact that your work has had in your partner schools?
Yeah. Well, how many more podcasts do I get to do? On and
well, Sam, you got an open invitation, so we'll see. We'll start racking them up.
There we go. There we go. Oh, we have so many stories. Let me share one story. This just happened the other day. I was at an elementary school that I've been supporting all year. And when we work with schools, we always start the year by identifying their inclusion goals, because I think a lot of times inclusion just feels very like vague and big, and it's like all the other like initiatives that schools are doing, whether it be UDL, PBIS, MTSS, right? It's just kind of big. And so I always try to help schools think about 1 to 3 goals. That's it. And some schools, the goal is to create the goals for the next year, right? Like we really want this to be successful, tangible, and measurable. So anyhow, I was at this school last couple weeks ago, and their goal this year was around social inclusion outside on the playground. So most of the time when I'm visiting the school, I'm observing the playground and talking to kids, etc. And so I was talking to this first grader, and she was telling me some stories about her life, and there was a lot of trauma going on, kind of a lot of challenging home situations for her. And she said, well, what's your job? What are you trying to do here? And I said, well, I visit schools and I try to make them better places for everybody. And she sat down on the bench next to me and she looked at me and she said, you're not trying, you're doing it.
Wow.
And that was so cool. So that's just like an example of like boots on the ground in the schools, what students are seeing.
That is great. That's a great story. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Can I share another story?
Absolutely, please.
So another story, a school district that I'm working with this year, I'm working with 4 schools within the district, like very targeted schools. But as a result of the work that I'm doing, that Changing Perspectives is doing in those 4 schools, it was kind of illuminated to the district the challenges that we have around inclusion and inclusive education. So as a result of that work and the data that we collected and the interviews we did with teachers, et cetera, the school district is changing their entire special education model next year. So all students are going to their neighborhood schools, regardless of disability.
Wow.
And this is a school district that was busing kids all over the place.
Yeah.
based on kind of the level of disability, whether they were classified as mild, moderate, or severe. And
Mhm.
so through this work, some of the light bulbs went off and they were like, if not now, then. Or if they were like, if not now, when? And when is next year? Changing the entire model, which is so exciting.
That is really exciting. Wow. Wow. Um, as someone who, is very familiar with the way our education system works, because you have partners all across the country and even internationally. Um, Sometimes I like to ask this question about the magic wand. So if you have, or if you had a magic wand and could change anything about schools, what would Sam Drazin do?
That I only get one wish, or there are multiple wishes.
Let's just start with the one wish.
If I had a magic wand and I could wish one thing, I would wish that folks who work in schools wouldn't put up so many mental barriers and blocks for why they can't, and really root our questions and our concerns through a lens of curiosity and figure out how we can. I guess another way that I would say it is that I would wish that everyone working in school systems, from the janitorial staff all the way up to the superintendent, would look at their work through a growth mindset lens rather than a fixed mindset lens. Because in my work, I find that it's not necessarily the students that are holding us back from creating more inclusive opportunity system that they are facilitating that are holding us back from inclusive opportunity. One of the things that I see a lot in education is in a system where teachers tend to be undervalued, underpaid, have a lot on their plate. We tend to be very defensive in terms of why we can't do things. And when I go into schools, a lot of times I hear, we don't have the time. We don't have the budget. I don't have the support. I don't have the training. I don't. We don't. And so I think the biggest thing that we can start to shift to see inclusion take hold is, rather than saying, I don't, we don't, I can't, how do we start to frame our questions around how do we? So rather than saying, I don't have the support, saying, how do we find the appropriate support so all students can thrive in my classroom? Instead of saying, I don't have the time to do that, how do we, or changing that to, how do I find the time to do that? And so ultimately, to answer your question, if I had a magic wand, one thing I would change about education is kind of, I almost see it as like sprinkling growth mindset fairy dust on all educators, all administrators, because as system leaders and as teachers working with students, we've got to change our mindset from a fixed mindset about how we've done things and why we can't do things differently to a growth mindset.
Oh yeah, that's great. Growth mindset. And like we said before, I really think that teachers, when given the opportunity and the time and the space and the support, more often than not, they are going to change their mindset or change their perspective, right? I mean, don't you feel like, again, the barrier is part of the barrier is that the teachers don't feel like they have um, the environment to change, as opposed to them not actually wanting to change.
Oh, yeah. I really find in the work that I do all across the country that teachers are hungry for this work. They want to support all their students. They see how students on the fringes are falling through the cracks, but there is this pressure that they've got to keep going, right? We're taught to teach what we might call the head pin in your school, whoever the head pin is in your school, right? We're taught to teach to those tier one kids. But actually, if we switch our mindset and we think about, well, what if we were teaching to the students on the margins? What if we designed opportunities to teach those students? Ultimately, that's going to support all students. I was at a school recently, and through the work, we were able to. I like to think of myself sometimes as a little bit of an agitator to the system, and going in and asking some hard questions. So I was at a school recently, and I was able to get the principal to get some subs for the day, and I was able to spend like 3 or 4 hours with a team of teachers. And they're really focused on what I call academic inclusions. We're thinking about differentiating content, universal design for learning, modifications, etc. And so I had them bring one unit with them, right? Paper on the computer, bring one unit you're teaching with your students. And we spent like 3 hours in a conference room, uninterrupted, just unpacking that unit and talking about ways that we can adjust it to make it more accessible for all of the learners. And the teachers left and they said, this was the best professional development time I've ever had, because they left with something tangible. They left with something that they had agency and ownership of, and something that they could go and actually do tomorrow and see the impacts of it.
That's so powerful. Because that just illustrates that when given time and space and the guidance to modify something or to think about how to deliver the instruction differently, they were so appreciative of it and said that this was the best training that we've ever had.
And it wasn't a training where someone was standing on a stage talking at, sitting around a table, conversing with, sharing resources real time, troubleshooting anticipated barriers.
Yeah. So what the story you just shared, that was part of what Changing Perspectives does. Is that right?
Yes. So we do a number of different things, and we really work with schools hand in hand and figure out, like, what are your goals? And then how do we achieve those goals? So at that school, the goals were much more around the academic inclusion, right? Ensuring that students who receive special education services who are in the general education classroom can better access and participate in the learning experience. And so one of the ways that we decided we were going to support that goal was going in and meeting with grade level teams and really unpacking curriculum changes. And the great thing about that is, like, that's what builds capacity and sustainability, right? The strategies that Changing Perspectives shared with these teachers on how to modify, differentiate, tweak their curriculum through a UDL lens is not solely used for the subject that we were talking about, right? I think we were talking about social studies. They could take those strategies that we talked about and apply them to all the other subjects they teach as elementary educators.
So I'd love to talk a little bit more about the services that you provide, but what that looks like for schools. So a couple questions come to mind. Is it something like a membership where yes, if a school wants to work with Changing Perspectives, they would have to pay for a certain number of seats, or like a membership per year? Is it more customizable, where it's like, okay, we're going to give you professional learning over the course of the school year, and it's going to be once a month for X amount of hours? What does that look like if a school wants to get involved?
Yeah, so it is completely customizable. We have an a la carte menu of 5 programs and services we offer. We have curriculum, virtual coaching, professional development, family engagement workshops, and on-site visits. And we work with schools to better understand where are they in their inclusion journey. Are they starting? Are they in the middle of their journey? Are they coming to the end? Where are they? And then from that sort of initial conversation and sort of assessment of where they're at, we identify their goals for next year. What are they really looking to achieve? And in this conversation, Tim, I've tried to infuse a whole bunch of examples from like that academic work to the example I shared on the playground. We work with some schools that we're really thinking about designing places and spaces to cultivate inclusive opportunities, right? So it really ranges. And then from the goals, we then look at what are the services that changing perspectives can provide to help you accomplish your goals. So it is very customizable. We really do strive, though, to not do one-offs with schools, not to come in and do a one and done PE, but really look at how do we provide some level of ongoing support throughout the course of the academic year. For some of the schools we work with, that's, once a month for an hour online. For other schools, it's much more hands-on and intensive. But it really varies. And we really strive to not be one more thing. We want to make sure that we are utilizing our services and supports to enhance where they're at in their inclusive journey, but also what are the other touch points? What are the other things they're doing in the school that we can weave into this work?
Right. So it can be integrated in whatever they're already implementing as opposed to one extra thing that they're doing.
Exactly. Like, for example, we're working with a few schools that are rolling out more of like a PBIS system this year. And so for PBIS, positive behavior intervention systems, that's a lot of classroom management and behavior, right? So those schools were really focusing with social inclusion work, right? So creating a sense of belonging, making sure all students feel valued, making sure all students feel heard, thinking about social opportunities in the cafeteria, playground, hallway. We're working with another school next year that's rolling out a new ELA curriculum. So with that school, really focusing on the academic inclusion because we're trying to infuse the inclusion work with the rollout of a new ELA adoption.
Right. That's that seems like it would be so beneficial to be able to add value to the programs and what a school is already doing as opposed to overlaying, a one more thing that they have to do. So
exactly. And I think, some schools and districts really want another outside group to come in and be like, here are the 5 steps to create a more inclusive environment, right? And they want that. It definitely takes a little more work on the school or the district's part to work with us because we are going to dive in a little deeper. We're not just going to plug and play what we think. We're going to take the time to get to know that community, the students that they serve, the other initiatives that are happening in their school system, and then put together a plan that's going to best support that as a whole.
Where can people find Changing Perspectives? I know that you have a website. It's like if people want to access the services, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, the best way is to email us directly because, again, since everything is customizable and personable, we're going to schedule a meeting to kind of learn more about the school system. So all of our contact information is on our website. Our website is changingperspectivesnow.org. Now, we're not doing this in the past. We're not doing this in the future. We're changing perspectives now. We're making schools better for all students today. We're also on, your social media platforms, we're also on your social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram. I don't know if it's called Twitter or X now, LinkedIn. We're on all of those, but going to our website, changingperspectivesnow.org and sending us an email is usually the best place to start.
Any final thoughts for educators as they're listening to our conversation?
I think inclusion can feel really overwhelming. It's no surprise that educators have a lot on their plate, especially this time of the school year. As I'm talking with folks, people are feeling a little overloaded towards the end of the school year. One of the things that I encourage teachers to think about is 10% change. This isn't about changing everything you do, but if every single educator can think about tweaking, augmenting, modifying, adjusting their practice by 10% every month, every week, every year, even, that's where we're going to see exponential growth. Because 10% here plus 10% here plus 10% here changes the environment for students. So I really encourage folks to not feel overwhelmed by this, but really take it in bite-sized chunks.
Amazing. Thank you, Sam. Sam, are you up for a mystery question?
I'm ready for your mystery question.
Okay. Right. We're on a good streak here with the mystery question. We've all been pretty good the last few times. So I'm hoping, but you know what? Today's special, Sam, with all of the stuff that's happened. Goodness. Okay, here we go. Nope. I'm not even going to read that one.
All right. I'm not even going to answer it.
This is interesting. Let's try this one. So, who is the best female role model in your life?
Ooh, these are tough questions. I thought it was going to be like, what is your favorite ice cream flavor or something like that?
It's so strange because it could go either way. It could be like something like super softball, and then it could also be like really, really deep. So, but I think this might be a good one.
Yeah. I'm going to say my mom. Um, and my mom was a social worker for her career, and she actually worked um, for a program in the state that we lived in at the time that supported students with disabilities. So she did a lot of home visits and helped families get, the services or equipment that they needed to support their students and their kids. And we lived in a very rural state. So there were a lot of challenges with a rural state. And so I think she was kind of a role model for me in terms of how do you dedicate your career to helping other people in one way or another.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Sam. So I'm just gonna, and I'm not sure if I'm gonna keep this, but I I think education is such a it's a female dominated um what's the word system. Um and I have a really quick story to tell you. Um so and it's like adjacent to what we're talking about. So I was just recently at a inclusion conference in North Carolina, and it was for early childhood education inclusion. And so I think it was the first day of of sessions, and I went in and I sat down in the second row of the session, and I pulled out my computer, I got my notes out, and the presenter was, getting ready and getting started, and she got up to the podium with the microphone, and I think she like put on her glasses or something, and she looked around and she said, "Oh, there's a man in the room." And I was like so taken aback. Like I wasn't exactly offended. It was more like, "Oh my gosh, everyone's looking at me." And everyone's noticing that I'm a different gender, which it doesn't like, I don't experience that a lot, but I guess in schools, you know, um, a lot of times there are definitely more women in schools than men in schools, especially in elementary, school, which is where I taught. And so I thought that was really interesting, and it made me, I don't know what it made me feel, but it's a funny story, so I wanted to share it. So that was one of the things. And so I think I've actually had a lot of female role models in my colleagues. So people that I've looked up to, whether they are educators or principals or even even my bosses here at MCIE, really strong people who believe in inclusion. But I'll tell you, the first person that I thought of when I like pull over that question was my wife, because she is like the best person that I know, and um, such a great mom, and such a wonderful wife, and so supportive of what I'm doing with MCIE, and all she's put up with me putting podcasts together for years and years and years. So I would have to say my wife. So that's a very long way to get to answer that question. Sam Drazin, thank you so much for being on the Think Inclusive podcast. We appreciate your time, and you are welcome back anytime.
Wonderful. Well, I will come back. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the ongoing collaboration.
That chime means it's free time. We're getting close to rounding out season 11 of Think Inclusive, and I wanted to take a few minutes to share some of my favorite episodes. All of these episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And so if any of these sound interesting to you, go ahead and check out the archives there. The first episode I want to highlight is the very first episode of this season, season 11. It's called The 5 Ps of Inclusive Education with Dr. Shelley Moore. Shelley discusses the 5 pillars of successful inclusion: positive attitude, placement, peers, purpose, and planning. She emphasizes the importance of believing in the possibility of inclusive education for all learners. And the episode highlights the need for a shift towards designing accessible learning environments from the start, focusing on grade-level curriculum goals, shared community experiences, and proactive planning for all learners. Shelley also talks about her dissertation and research that shows that proper support and conditions can lead to academic success for students with intellectual disabilities in inclusive settings, particularly in secondary schools. So check that one out on your favorite podcast player. The next episode I wanted to highlight is with the director of the Office of Special Education Programs, Valerie Williams. Valerie and I discussed the importance of inclusion in education, specifically in early childhood education. And actually, this episode is part of a series that was produced with the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center, which is a national technical assistance center for early childhood that helps state agencies all across the country. This conversation underscores the significance of early inclusion for sustained educational benefits. Director Williams stresses the roles of adults in fostering inclusive environments and the need for technical assistance to support educators across the state and across the nation. It's a great episode. I highly recommend it. That's Valerie Williams, episode 9 of season 11. And there really are so many episodes that are wonderful, so I encourage you to listen to all of season 11 as we're going to be taking a break starting in July, and we won't be back until September. But another one that sticks out in my mind is a conversation that I had with Tim Harris, the king of hugs. Tim Harris, who happens to have Down syndrome, discusses inclusion and his experience of owning a restaurant, his book called The Book of Hugs, his public speaking, his dreams, and his advice for people with disabilities. It's a great conversation. We talk about everything from his high school experience to the support of his family to his love of singing and acting. You're not going to want to miss this one. That's episode 6 of season 11. All right, that's it for this episode of Think Inclusive. Think Inclusive was written, edited, designed, mixed, and mastered by me, Tim Villegas, and is a production of the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education. Original music by Miles Kredich, additional music from Melody. Thanks to our sponsor this week, And for the month of June, the Described and Captioned Media Program. Learn more at dcmp.org. Only one more official episode of Season 11 before we take some time off for the summer. Over 140, close to 150 episodes for you to catch up are available for you on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for your time and attention, and remember, inclusion always works. From MCIE.